Thank you. Thank you, Mark, for all your help. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to this advanced grant presentation and discussion. So there will be an opportunity for some discussion at the end. If we can just go straight to the next slide. I'm Wendy Pogozalski from SUNY Geneseo. I really want to start with some thank yous, as I did this morning, but I want to thank you for your support of us as faculty members. You have many times given us words of encouragement, and these your belief in us has really made a difference to us, so I want to thank you for that. I also want to thank you for your cooperation with this baseline survey. NSF requires us to have a sort of a measurement of some change, and so we're using this survey as part of that. And you know, I know nobody loves surveys, but if you could fill that out, it is something that would mean a lot to us. We have, I think, about 18 out of 60 responses so far. And also we want to thank you for the very thoughtful and I'm sure stressful decision-making that has been part of the past couple of months or so and continues to be on your plate. Okay, so if we can move ahead. During the presentation, we really welcome you to submit questions or comments via the chat. Also consult the Google Doc that will have links to our webpage and to the administrator survey, to the scorecards for each institution. And at the end, as I said, there will be an opportunity for you to share with us some of the initiatives that you have on your own campuses. We really believe that joint problem solving is what is useful. One of the things that's useful about COPLAC coming together like this. Okay. Next slide, please. So I want to introduce our team to you. It's a wonderful team that I'm just very happy to be working with these women. So in addition to myself, we have Carlene West from the Department of Political Science and International Relations at SUNY Geneseo. And moving on, we have Shavonda Mills, Chair and Professor of Chemistry at Georgia College, Sally Wesolowski, Chair and Professor of Chemistry at UNC Asheville, Josephine Rodriguez, Associate Professor of Biology at UVA Wise. And we have Cara Margario, who is our evaluator, and she is the Assistant Director for the Center of Evaluation and Research for STEM Equity at the University of Washington. And Darcy Dombrowski is our Grant Manager, and who's housed here at SUNY Geneseo. So the agenda here will be that you'll hear from each of the members of this team. We'll start with Shavonda and Josephine, who will talk about the impact of some of the current things that are going on that impact on women. We'll talk about our collecting baseline data. Carlene West will talk about that. Affinity Groups will be handled by Sally Wesolowski. I'll then just give us a few conclusions, and then finally, Cara will facilitate our discussion with institutional sharing. So I'll turn it over to my colleagues.
Great, thank you, Wendy. So if you could go to the next slide, Darcy. Thank you. So what we have here is just a collection of headlines that are obviously part of the current events that we're facing in this country. Last week, our advanced program director, Dr. Jessie Diaro, wrote the advanced PIs and co-PIs to remind us that there are flexibilities within projects to make adjustments in response to current events, such as COVID-19. And again, these are just a few of the headlines that are germane to COVID-19 and gender equity in STEM fields. And we prepared a summary of impacts on women in STEM in the following slides. And our Google document will have references to all of these links. Darcy, can you go back one? Sorry. So I want to highlight in the middle, there's the impact of COVID-19 on academic mothers. This was written by Fernanda Staniszewski et al., published in Science. And they stress that young children and canceled schools provide unique challenges to mothers, which are more likely to do chores and homeschooling of children instead of writing papers. And below it, we have The Pandemic and the Female Academic, written by Alessandra Manillo. And she reported that academic work requiring publications and obtaining grants for career advancement is, quote, basically incompatible with tending to children. And what we're finding is the pattern that is emerging is that COVID-19 is disproportionately impacting women, particularly women that have more childcare and homeschooling duties. Next slide. So this is a preprint available through Archive. And this was written by Myers et al., quantifying the immediate effects of COVID-19 pandemic on scientists. They surveyed 4,500 PIs across Europe and the United States in mid-April. And what they report are steep declines in the time spent on research on average, but there was some heterogeneity because there are actually some scientists that are able to get more research done and some scientists that reported no change. What was most negatively impacted are their lab-based fields. Female scientists did report larger declines, and those largest disruptions were reported to childcare. So the take-home message here was having a young dependent was associated with declines comparable to those seen in lab-based fields, and this accounts for a significant fraction of those gender differences. Overall, mothers are disproportionately impacted. Okay, and then the next slide is, these are some of those talking points that speak to this decrease in research productivity. The bottom headline, if I could draw your attention there, gender disparity in authorships of manuscripts on the COVID-19 outbreak. This was published in the Journal of Public Health from Theory to Practice by Batante et al. And they found that during the COVID-19 outbreak, female researchers tended to publish fewer manuscripts than men and were less represented in those relevant authorship positions, which are, of course, those first and last positions in the list of authors. Next slide. So this is another preprint that was published by Anderson et al. COVID-19 medical papers have fewer women first authors than expected. And again, they analyzed 1,893 medical papers related to the pandemic. They compared the gender distribution of authors to the same journals in 2019 for papers with first authors and last authors from the United States. And they estimated that the women's shares of first authorships, last authorships, and general representation per author group were 23%, 16%, and 16% respectively lower for COVID-19 papers compared to 2019 papers in those same journals. Overall take-home message is that this research productivity of women, especially early career women, were more affected than research productivity of men. Next slide. This is actually a report that was published by the Australian government. Emma Johnson and all led a team that wrote this report. It's the impact of COVID-19 on women in the STEM workforce. What they also noted was women from diverse backgrounds already have additional barriers to entry, retention, and progression in STEM. They also anticipated COVID-related funding cuts to equity programs would set back those gains that women have made in STEM workforce diversity. And probably the most kind of poignant note that they made was, especially at risk were these hard-won gains by women in STEM. Next slide. And then this brings me to the last slide I'll be presenting, and on the impacts of COVID-19. So these are just a collection of some of the headlines that are germane to COVID-19 and STEM equity. And I'll draw your attention to the top headline, that's Pandemic Risks Wiping Out Hard-Won Gains by Women in STEM. This was written by Yolanda Hutchinson. And she wrote that this crisis has intensified the documented double burden of women working from home and managing remote learning for children, and employers need to be vigilant on gender equity. In the middle of the slide, I have Lost Ground, Female Academics Face an Uphill Battle in a Post-Pandemic World by Stadnick and Black. This was published in the journal Hydrological Processes. And they wrote that we need to be cautious post-pandemic. There is the potential for fewer females in leadership positions and fewer of those female voices at the table, which could potentially lead to an increased gap in gender equity. And I want to especially highlight the bottom headline there, STEM Equity and Inclusion Uninterrupted. This was written by Goodwin and Mechnik, who are also fellow advance awardees. And they noted that understanding how the pandemic will differentially impact STEM women, particularly women of color, will be key for institutional leaders to identify and deliver equitable and inclusive solutions in the wake of this crisis. This paper was particularly important to us because it really highlighted that, and it really advocated for women of color and highlighted that we're actually at this intersection of two crises, COVID-19 and increased racial tensions in our country. And this brings us to my colleague, Dr. Mills.
Thank you, Josephine. Hello, everyone. Shavonda Mills from Georgia College presenting. As Josephine mentioned, other current events that are impacting higher education, particularly faculty and administrators of color, are recent race-related incidents and escalating racial tensions across the globe. The science community has responded to these recent events by releasing statements and editorials in various outlets. Some of the headlines are highlighted on this slide. Editorials published in June issues of Science and Nature bring attention to evidence of systemic racism in science and underscore the importance for scientists to make space for people of color to lead. Specifically, the authors bring attention to the lack of a diverse science professoriate, underfunding of scientific areas studied more frequently by people of color, and a general lack of support for faculty of color when opportunities for advancement become available. Most notably, the scientific community responded to global protests for the Black Lives Matter movement. And on June 10th, academics and scientific organizations stopped research activities and reflected on how to take action on systemic inequalities in science. More than 5,000 scientists, as well as societies, universities, and publishers, joined a strike for Black lives to learn about systemic racism in the research community and to work on ways to address inequalities. Our advanced team participated in this important day of reflection, and we emerged with a renewed energy and recognition that we are at the intersection of two crises, COVID-19 and escalating racial tensions. As such, we decided to take this opportunity to make some adjustments to the COPLAC ADVANCE plan to better serve women faculty, especially women of color in STEM. Next slide, Darcy. So our COPLAC ADVANCE plan has two major objectives, the first of which is shown here: professional development training in gender equity and data analysis across COPLAC. During our foundational year, our program activities consist of recruitment of a program manager, recruitment of an external advisory board, which consists of representatives from across COPLAC institutions that were previously awarded advance grants, collection of baseline data about intersectional identities at various faculty ranks across COPLAC, as well as policies and procedures related to equity at COPLAC institutions. We are building a library of resources to be shared at national meetings and on our website. And we're also developing training workshops on gender equity in STEM for presentation at COPLAC's Summer 2021 meeting. Next slide. Our second objective focuses on the formation of affinity groups to support women faculty in STEM. This first year, our efforts focused on surveying potential participants to identify interests and categories for our affinity groups. More information will be shared later in the presentation about these categories. We also recruited leaders for our affinity groups. These leaders will meet virtually with the COPLAC Advanced Leadership Team later this summer. And finally, we're creating a formal plan for our affinity groups. The plan includes identifying meeting venues such as Zoom and listservs, as well as drafting of group guidelines and confidentiality statements. Next slide. So since we are in the first year of implementation of our grant activities, we feel that we are well positioned to modify our plan in response to COVID-19 and race-related incidents. Regarding our affinity groups, we're looking to expand our topics and include those that are specific to the impact of COVID-19 on women faculty. Josephine shared overwhelming evidence which suggests an adverse impact of COVID-19 on research productivity and work-life balance. We are also employing a targeted recruitment effort for women of color from all STEM disciplines. This extends beyond our initial pilot disciplines and is in response to a low response rate from potential participants of this demographic. Regarding baseline data, we've added questions to assess how COVID-19 is affecting the productivity of women and minoritized faculty, as well as questions to assess how systemic racism is affecting the advancement of women of color in STEM. And finally, regarding our training workshops, we will include strategies to support the advancement of women and minoritized faculty in the aftermath of COVID-19, as well as evidence-based strategies to sustain an inclusive and productive work environment for all faculty during periods of escalating racial tensions. Now, Carlene will speak to our institutional scorecards.
Thank you so much, Shavonda. This is Carlene West from Geneseo talking. I'm going to present data. No good STEM presentation is ever complete without some data presentation. And I just want to reference the fact that almost all of you probably should have received institutional scorecards from Darcy, our program manager, this past week. If you haven't, they're also available on our website. You can check out the Google Doc that we've shared with you to view those institutional scorecards if you wish. The data that we are using to create these institutional scorecards was collected in 2018 as we prepared for this grant proposal. I just want to make sure that everyone understands that the data was provided by all COPLAC institutions' institutional research divisions. So we took that data from institutional research that was provided to us by them and summarized it. I also want to note that unfortunately we are missing data from 8 institutions. Those institutions did not respond to our call for that data as we put together the NSF grant proposal. Those 8 institutions do include 2 institutions that weren't even part of COPLAC at the time. They're currently provisional members of COPLAC. And I want to emphasize that this data is intended to provide a baseline of knowledge for us and for you. I want to be sure that you recognize that there's no judgment involved with the collection of this data. It's to give us all an idea of where you are now. And what I'm going to elaborate on here is some context for you as well, because no individual data point makes sense without the larger context of the COPLAC Association as a whole. So next slide, Darcy. So this is the first contextual data presentation here. This figure shows the percentage of women faculty in STEM fields across all COPLAC institutions for which we have data. I want to emphasize that this does include both tenure track and non-tenure track faculty. I want to highlight that the dashed line there, the reference line on the figure, is referring to the COPLAC average of 44%. So that's the average percent of women across COPLAC institutions. And I also just want to highlight the range that is expressed among COPLAC institutions. They range, women are present at a rate of 34% all the way up to 54% in STEM fields across COPLAC. Okay, next slide. I'm going to highlight Geneseo data here as an example, my home institution. This figure gives us the percentage of women faculty in STEM by rank. You can see Geneseo highlighted there with the red arrows. You can see, looking at that Geneseo data, that the rank where there is the smallest proportion of women is among full professors. 28% of full professors are women in STEM fields at Geneseo. Okay, and the rank where there is the largest proportion of women in STEM fields at Geneseo is among assistant professors, in which 46% of all assistant professors in STEM fields at Geneseo are women. Okay, oh, I go back, Darcy, I forgot to say one thing. I also just want to note that we included the N there. So the N is the overall number of STEM faculty at each given institution. So there are nearly 200 STEM faculty at Geneseo. Okay, go on. Okay, so this is the Geneseo scorecard that is a sample of the type of scorecard that most of you should have received from Darcy this past week. And again, this provides greater detail and nuance about the representation of women at your institution from the year 2017. There is breakdown by department. So I just want to again highlight at Geneseo, for example, recall that assistants had the largest proportion of women at Geneseo. And you can see there, you can look at the percentage of women in the assistant professor column. And that number at Geneseo ranges from 29% in my home department of political science and goes all the way up to 100% in the departments of physics and astronomy and anthropology. Okay, next slide. And then finally, this was some additional initial data that we gathered as we were compiling facts for the grant proposal. And I just want to highlight again the kind of range that we see across COPLAC for some of these policies that are known to support women faculty, not just in STEM, but really across institutions, across departments. And so, for example, across COPLAC, 4.3% of COPLAC schools that responded to our initial data gathering survey have a formal policy for on-site childcare. Okay, that's the smallest percentage for a formal policy. And then the largest percentage of COPLAC schools have the policy of paid parental leave. So 73.9% of COPLAC schools have paid parental leave in place to support parents in their faculty. Okay, so thank you all for the attention that you gave to this data, and I'm happy to answer questions if you have them. And at this time, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Sally.
Hello, I'm Sally Wazaleski at UNC Asheville. Creating virtual affinity groups is one of the main components of our plan project. And these groups connect women across COPLAC as we are geographically and professionally isolated at our home institutions and provide resources and a support infrastructure. For year one, we've created a pilot program of 10 affinity groups so that we can gain feedback on the format, the structure, and training before rolling out a full program. And for the pilot, we've selected a subset of STEM disciplines. You can go to the next slide. And reached out to a list of department chairs shared with us in order to get the most current contact information of women faculty in these departments. So 57% of chairs have responded, creating a pool of 344 women faculty. Of those, 17% expressed interest in being part of our pilot program, which includes 60 women in 10 affinity groups. We also asked the pool of women faculty about some of their experiences, demographic information, and their preferences on how to participate in the affinity groups, such as a leader or as a participant, and the topical areas or intersectional characteristics that they felt were most important to them in how groups were constructed. The pilot participants are about half at the assistant professor level, but are distributed across faculty rank. And participants also represent over 80% of COPLAC institutions, with the majority of institutions having a few participants and a few having 6 or more participants. So we are feel that a good number of COPLAC institutions are represented in the pilot. It is critically important to the COPLAC Plan Initiative and for the NSF ADVANCE program in general to support women faculty at different intersections, such as women of color, and not focus on white heterosexual women that comprise the majority of women STEM faculty. So for our pilot group, we have over 20% participation of non-white women faculty. We do not yet know if our pilot group is an overrepresentation or an underrepresentation of the racial composition of women in STEM across COPLAC. And this also extends to the intersection of sexual orientation, where the majority of our pilot participants are heterosexual, but we don't have the data right now to know if this is an overrepresentation or an underrepresentation of women STEM faculty. But we do know of the known benefits of structured affinity groups, and as Shavonda mentioned earlier, we're hoping to increase the participation of women of color, especially Black women of color, who may be from a different department, not part of the pilot, or part of the faculty whose contact information was not shared with us. So at this point, we really request your help. If you could please share the contact information of STEM faculty at your institutions who are women of color. We would greatly appreciate that so that we could invite them to participate in our affinity groups. There is a hyperlink in our Google Doc to email our project manager, Darcy Dombrowski, directly, or you can see her email address on the slide. In addition, we also request that you encourage involvement in the affinity groups among women faculty at your institution. So the next steps are leader training, which are coming up very soon. And we can go to the perfect. So the leader training is coming up very soon with the rollout of the pilot groups starting this coming academic year. So just in a few weeks, actually. And then over the next academic year, we will be providing resources and training to the affinity groups, and we'll assess and optimize the group structure. And based on the feedback, we'll expand the number of affinity groups significantly into the coming year. So at this point, I will transition to the next speaker to go over our conclusions.
Okay, thank you, Sally, and thank you, everyone. Just to let you know that over the next year, we will also be developing materials for case studies that we will present at the next COPLAC meeting. And if you have a story that would be useful for a case study, then we're very interested in that. We'll be adapting from a library of existing case studies as well. And we'll be continuing to study the success of women and women with intersectional identities, really trying to contribute to support and continuing to assess and problem solve. So we hope to see you in person at the next meeting. But I'm now going to turn things over to Kara Margario, who is going to facilitate some discussion. And I hope that some of you will be willing to share about some of the initiatives that you've had at your own institutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy. So yes, we'd like to now open up the session to hear from all of you. And we thought that we'd start with institutional sharing. So what policies and practices do you already have in place to support women faculty and women of color faculty in particular? You are welcome to type brief responses in the chat window, and then we'll ask folks to unmute and share. And also, if you have any burning questions at this point in time, feel free to ask those of us as well.
Well, I'll give one example of something to share. I'm a co-PI, but something from my own institution that I can't take credit for. But our provost, Garakai Campbell, has initiated this academic year a new format for our annual faculty record to collect more information about the type of work that faculty do and the value of that work, such as trying to quantify some of our service load, talk about how we engage with students from diverse populations, how we contribute to community across campus, and things that aren't just how many presentations, how many publications, how many students in your classroom. So that's just one example that might inspire some others to share some things that are going on at your institutions.
Sally, this is Scott Beard from Shepherd University. And as we were looking at faculty workload over the past year, as of course it relates to budget and what we might be doing, that's been a really tricky thing in terms of trying to quantify that or weight that, because I'm sure many of you have the usual suspects, as we call them, that are perform a lot of the service on campus. You know, those that do seem to continue to do and fill their plates, and how to quantify that. So that's really interesting with the badging. Were you doing that through something like I'm familiar with a company called, I think it's Portfolium or something like that? Is it linked to your LMS or anything like that, or just a separate thing that folks quantify through annual reporting?
So this is a good question. So for year one, we were asked to provide some estimates, and the ranges were pretty large about like numbers of hours of service, for example, at university level, at department level. This was created with our, not by me, but our faculty senate and our provost together, Garakai Campbell. And we used Google Forms actually to upload. This is a challenging budget time in North Carolina as we refunded students their room and board. Yeah, that was the mechanism that was used, and at least for 2020.
Yes,
Now, that would be really helpful. I think Karen mentioned that too. I would just say that the past academic year, we did institute a parental leave policy related to birth, child care, surrogacy, adoption, regardless of the gender of the parent. So that was something new that was put into place for faculty who aren't leave earning like some of our other staff. So that was greeted pretty well, that we were able to address that and work with our gender and women's study board to get that policy in place.
Yeah, I can also share some activities at Georgia College. My name is Crossdisciplinary, and I serve as provost at the university. So over the last 8 or so years, we've made a concerted effort to support faculty in leadership development, and we invested considerable resources in those experiences. One of the outlets, or one of the places that we've supported a lot of female faculty members has been to participate in HERS, H-E-R-S, that I think all of you are familiar with. In fact, every year we've supported at least one faculty member to be part of the experience. In fact, one year we had 3 faculty members, and again, as you can imagine, that's clearly a significant investment on our part. I think Shavonda can talk a little bit more about the specifics, and I think Shavonda, we've had about 9 or so faculty members that have participated and those in administrative positions have participated in HERS over the years. So that's been an annual. We do have a committee on campus comprised of HERS graduates that are involved in identifying the new faculty members to participate in that. But we've also, we started this past year a leadership development program on campus, and Shavonda, along with another colleague from the College of Education, have led this initiative. So and that proved to be very, very successful. and this is all women. And I think we had about 9, if I remember correctly. Maybe I got my numbers a little bit confused here, but we had a good number in the first cohort of women participating in our own women's leadership development program. But beyond that, we've had a lot of faculty that have participated in department chair, whether it's been the ACE, the American Council on Education, the AAC ASKU, for example, Emerging Leaders Program. So this has been an area that we've been very, very serious about, and we have consistently, year after year, supported women leaders on campus to strengthen their skills. And to a great extent, we see that as an opportunity, obviously, for their growth, but also for the institution, because their participation in those initiatives provides a great return on our investment and really strengthens the university moving forward. So that's some of the things that we're doing at Georgia College.
I'm Melinda Trevon, the president at Keene State, and I actually had, I just wanted first and foremost to thank Dr. Battles and the grant writing team and this leadership team that has progressed. I was privileged to hear the presentation at our retreat in January, and I'm just so impressed by what you've been able to accomplish despite all the disruption that has been around all of us. So congratulations and my thanks for your leadership. My question, actually, it's a question and then actually a request for your recommendations. The question is, what surprised you as you went through the research and the survey data? Was there anything that surprised you as scholars in these fields and as individuals immersed in developing the grant language? Were there things that surprised you, and if so, what? And then my request is, what would you advise a collegiate president with regard to specific, 1 or 2 specific things that would make a difference for new faculty or for mid-career faculty in these areas that are most important from your perspective? And thank you.
Okay, if I could start, maybe my colleagues have some other things. But I think as I was doing the literature, I had no idea that my experiences were not unique. So I really had thought it was just me who was burdened with letters of recommendation, and it was just me who had way more advisees than everyone else. And, but these things were really very common across the board. They were also common in men who were particularly receptive and giving, but by and large, these tasks were very much skewed to women. So departments just sort of doing kind of an audit to look at their teaching loads and make sure that their teaching loads are equitable. I think that's a really good thing for department chairs. The other thing is that when, especially in STEM, the startup package is a big part of your success. And I don't mean to unfairly stereotype or anything like that, but women by and large are not really trained in negotiation skills, and they get more pushback when they do negotiate. And so I think it really helps if administrators look out for their new hires a little bit, whether that's department chairs or people above. And I know when you're trying to balance budgets, you're saying, hallelujah, this person only wants $10,000 or something. But given that the consequences of a startup package can really be long-term, I think a little bit of making sure that women have the same kind of startup package as the male candidates is something that's very important. So that would be the 2 things that I could think of.
One thing that I will say too, what we found interesting, it kind of went counter to our expectations. When we recruited for the affinity groups, many of us expected women to say that they wanted to join affinity groups that were part of their own, reflective of their own discipline. And actually what we found was to the contrary, that women hardly ever said that they wanted to join an affinity group for just biologists or just chemists. Rather, they wanted more, broader topics like grant proposal writing or leadership skills, right? And one thing that we kind of brainstormed was, we're not certain of what the mechanism is behind that, but we all sort of thought, maybe we're just used to being the only one. And so at our and so we tend to think more broadly, but so that kind of leads to the policy of maybe making sure that women in STEM fields are able to connect to one another across departments. that is somehow facilitated. And then the other thing, of course, to keep in mind is that women in STEM are interested in things much larger than their own discipline, than just studying biology and chemistry. So always keeping that in mind and providing opportunities for women in those fields to expand outside their disciplinary boundaries.
Thank you.
I might add just one other thing, which is my college set up a mentoring program, and the mentoring was cross-disciplinary. In fact, that is how Carlene and I met. So, and it wasn't much. They gave us lunch and we ran with it, right? So.
Great.
That's right.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'll add one thing as what would advise to a college president, is that and I'm a department chair, and so spend a lot of time reflecting inward as to what are the choices and the policies and the fast fixes, the putting out fires, fast fixes that propagate inequity, because that's where it happens so easily. And really looking at the power that people have to propagate inequity across the institution. There's a lot of power that department chairs have in teaching loads, assigning service, things like that, but without really much training or incentive to do it in an equitable fashion. And then that exists throughout the academic structure. And so that really looking inward and making it a priority and being very mindful for the different ways that that we all propagate inequity knowingly and also unknowingly.
Outstanding. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. And again, thank you for the work and leadership.
Hi, I did put something in the chat there. Maybe it wasn't understood, but in one of the lists, it was an informal practice of childcare. And I was wondering what exactly that may have meant. Or, was that just we bring our kids to campus because we have to, and that's considered the informal practice of childcare, or was there something else there?
So Wendy, correct me if I'm wrong, that came from the initial survey to institutions, and it was basically a multiple choice response, right? Institutions could say we have a formal policy, or we have an informal practice, or we have no policy. And so I don't know what this particular institution was trying to suggest by saying that they have an informal practice of an on-site daycare. Maybe it is something like you're suggesting. Maybe it's like an after-school program, or where faculty are able to bring their children to campus. I don't know, but one institution, and I could look and see who that was, but one institution said that they did have this informal practice. So
I think it also might be about having informal policy. So we have formal policies that are kind of written in and everyone gets them in their contracts or they're in their strategic plan. And then there are informal practices, so the norms. So maybe it's not written into your contract that they're going to help support you around childcare, but they have a norm of having flexibility around leaving early to pick your child up or drop your child off. So it might also be around that as well. But it's a little unclear. Yeah.
Yeah, I assumed that it meant sort of non-uniformly applied, non-codified. Yeah.
Which is often the challenge with informal practices, that's really where inequities can sneak in, because who has access to them, who knows about them, who's able to use them, etc.
I'll ask another question if that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
So can you, I will not use the word define, but can you, have you seen a difference, or are there differences in leadership by way of service versus leadership by way of doing your scholarship? And so, some of those may not be mutually exclusive, but one might say that if you're teaching well at our institutions, teaching is, of a priority. For teaching well and doing service and scholarship, that's a great thing. But you know, a leader could be someone who's doing a lot of scholarship, who's then able to be very productive in their field, but then there are some who might be really productive in their service. And so I'm not sure you want to differentiate the two, or have you seen a difference in terms of what leadership might be, or what you might be looking for with some of your studies about those who do a lot of service versus those who are really just productive in scholarship, or those who might be doing both?
Well, one of the things that we saw was that there were a lot of women stagnating in the associate professor positions. So they had done enough research to be promoted and tenured, and then they just did not move forward. And many of them at this stage felt that they were doing the lion's share of service, while some of their colleagues who were promoted to full professor had primarily scholarship and had opted out of a lot of the service. So there's some good data on that and some good studies. I'm not sure that it answers your question really related to leadership, but certainly related to promotion, we've seen this.
Yeah, thank you. That's
sure.
I think I'll just add one more thing, which is a lot of where we see inequity propagate is what is the most valued aspect of someone's work. And oftentimes scholarly activity holds a significant value, but yet what are the other responsibilities that women faculty tend to take on that have to be done, are very important, and that they shoulder a greater load, that then there's only 24 hours in a day. And so that's really, it's not so much there's a choice necessarily in how the responsibilities come. And so what we see is not necessary, is the effect of that is a greater number of women at the associate professor rank, to build off of what Wendy had said.
And I would also add that some of that is, you know, not a top-down thing necessarily, as it is driven by student expectations. And so many of us talk about experiencing, you know, we're the first professor to go to for a letter of recommendation. We're the first professor to go to if a student is sick and wants an extension on something. You know, the expectation of being nice and agreeable and accommodating is very, very gendered. So one of the things that we've really been talking about is if we could just sometimes, if these things are valued that we're doing, if we can just make them count. On my faculty activity form, if I could be asked how many letters of recommendation did I write? Yeah, so some of these things about counting and making this work more visible and more valued.
I see a lot of the COPLAC leadership here today, and I'm curious regarding tenure clocks and COVID-19. Have any of the institutions present addressed that issue? Any pausing of clocks, any opt-in, opt-out options? Hate to put you on the spot, but.
This is Scott from Shepherd. We have given faculty the option because we also made our course evaluations optional in the spring, although most faculty opted to do them. But we have given faculty the flexibility to stop the clock if they're on a tenure stream position. So it's really just on a case-by-case basis.
So this is Denise, and actually I think our provost weighed in even as I was unmuting, but our system took the initiative on this, and so the SUNY system has a one-year opportunity that is an opt-out process, but also I believe there's an opportunity that extends. We have a different kind of system in that we have collective bargaining, and I believe that extends to our professional staff, but not for a full year. So certainly includes faculty, but goes beyond that.
President Battles and others, I'm curious to know if your decision to extend the tenure clock, whether it was an institution or system decision, was based primarily on the administrators coming together and saying this is something that our faculty would benefit from, or were you hearing from your faculty that this was something that they wanted and they felt there was a need for?
Well, and having been in a number of different systems, there are different takes, and ours is a very centralized one. So certainly there was a lot of discussion, say, between our chief, provosts, our chief academic officers, and SUNY system. So I wouldn't say it was something that the system did that wasn't contributed to by the institutions, but given that we are collectively bargained, and tenure is a key piece of that, I think it probably would have had to be done in coordination with the system rather than each institution taking its own initiative. But certainly there was a conversation that was being had about the desirability of giving some options on the tenure clock.
And I'll just say for Keene State, it surfaced at a time we are collective bargaining campus, and it was during times where we were discussing alternate grading policies that we also discussed impacts on tenure, on promotion, and with our faculty created what was our final option for faculty to opt in to continue on schedule or to delay based on a request up through the process. And it was largely due to the fact that for a number of our research faculty, their research was impacted as we shut down research this spring. So there was a great deal of concern for the administration and the faculty, frankly, that the research that our faculty would normally be able to complete would have been halted and dramatically interrupted during what would be one of the important semesters of their portfolio. So that's where we landed, and it was a mutual conversation at the time we were discussing grading. And we moved to that as well, so thank you.
Yeah, I was going to comment that our faculty evaluation process really was left up to the faculty to, or the student evaluation process was left up to the faculty during the spring term to decide to what extent they wanted to utilize the instructional evaluation or the student evaluation. In terms of the tenure process, we are in a centralized system, but the system did not indicate whether changes should be made. In conversations with other provosts within the University System of Georgia, what it seems to be taking place is that the majority of the institutions, or a number of institutions, are looking or requesting that candidates make a note of the experience that they've had when they submit their material for review for tenure and promotion. So that way it is documented, and the committees and the evaluation process would take that into consideration.
We've been discussing what all you all have been doing to respond to COVID-19, and I'm wondering if any of you have begun implementing policies or practices to address racial injustice in light of the current events and protests going on.
I would just offer that at Keene State, we have with my diversity coordinator, equity and diversity coordinator, and with a group of faculty, we are retaining some outside support and doing an internal audit of all university policies and practices to identify whether there are institutional bias or unintended prejudice that is adversely impacting any group that is underrepresented. So we've embarked upon a top to bottom review of all policy and practice to that effort, and we're also specifically trying to look at hiring practices. So I've requested a recommendation from our human resources team on search processes, training and education around microaggression or bias that can surface during search and hiring processes as well. So we'll be, I'm sure that's not unique to Keene State, but it is something we're embarking upon we had started the policy review in November, actually, of this past year, but we've accelerated it, requested a formal report by the end of this semester.